So I've been reading William James, Varieties of Religious Experience, and I came across this concept that it seemed kind of strange to me. So as William James, as the author, is going through different religious propensities that people have, religious perspectives that people have, that certain saints have. One of these concepts is the concept of obedience. But the concept of obedience is kind of put on a very high pedestal. It's almost eternally sanctioned to the point of saying that obedience is the only thing that matters in life. You might think that, okay, well, yeah, that makes sense. As a Christian, you have to obey God. But it's not just obedience to God. It's obedience to your human superiors as well. Let me read some excerpts to kind of show what I mean. This is a quote by Alfonso Rodriguez. One of the great consolations of the monastic life, says the Jesuit authority, is the assurance we have that in obeying we can commit no fault. The superior may commit a fault in commanding you to do this thing or that, but you are certain that you commit no fault so long as you obey, because God will only ask you if you have duly performed what orders you received. And if you can furnish a clear account in that respect, you are absolved entirely. Whether the things you did were opportune or whether there were not something better that might have been done, these are questions not asked of you, but rather of your superior. The moment what you did was done obediently, God wipes it out of your account and charges it to your superior. In another excerpt, William James quotes Bartoli Michel, saying, I ought to desire that my superior should oblige me to give up my own judgment and conquer my own mind. I must put all of my fervor in executing zealously and exactly what I am ordered. I must consider myself as a corpse which has neither intelligence nor will, be like a mass of matter which without resistance lets itself be placed wherever it may please anyone. Like a stick in the hand of an old man who uses it according to his needs and places it where it suits him. So must I be under the hands of the order to serve it in the way it judges most useful. So, and this seems strange, right? Because this is obviously reflecting the obedience that one must have towards their religious leaders, which ultimately in Catholicism leads to the Pope. So this is a commentary on obeying authority and the maximum authority being the Pope. And this is different from Protestant Christianity, which in Protestant Christianity has another value, which is the concept of the priesthood of every believer, saying that every believer is a priest, every believer is responsible for their own actions. And so that is very different from what we see here. And here, maybe not in all of Catholicism, but these saints are commending maximum obedience to your superiors. But not only does this go against that concept of the priesthood of every believer, but also post the Nazi events, there was almost a unanimous agreement that even when you follow orders of your superiors, you are still responsible for your own actions. You are still responsible for your own conscience. You can't just follow orders and by following orders be absolved. So yes, there's obviously disagreement between American culture, between the Protestant culture, and what we see here as far as putting obedience in such a high pedestal. It's very problematic to try and understand this through the mentality of a Protestant or even an American mentality. And so how can we come to understand this? Because when you read through this, even if you disagree with it, you would still be able to acknowledge that it has a solid argument. So how can we take these two opposing concepts and harmonize them enough so that they can at least fit together in some sort of way? In another passage it says, Saint John Climacus is of the same sentiment when he calls obedience an excuse before God. In fact, when God asks why you have done this or that and you reply, it is because I was ordered by my superiors, God will ask for no other excuse. With this passage, I kind of understood a little bit. God will ask for no other excuse. Why is that? Because that's actually all you need to make a judgment. If you're following orders and you do something right, everything's in line and there's no issues there. But if you're following orders and you do something wrong, one of two possibilities could happen. The first one is that somewhere along the line, somewhere along the hierarchy, there was a superior that was wrong, and you're just following those orders. If that's the case, well, that superior is responsible. The other possibility is that the superior was not wrong, but you have a wrong superior. You have an evil superior. If you do something wrong and you're following orders, you might be following orders from a leader, from a superior that's not even under God's hierarchy. So that puts you somewhere else. You will not be held accountable for obeying, but you will be held accountable for the leader that you chose. That's to say that God is not responsible for the consequences of your actions, but your evil superior, the superior that's outside of God's realm, your evil superior, that's Satan. You'd have to deal with him and his consequences, in his hierarchy and his legalities and whatever, however his system works. But what all this points to is basically there's two philosophies in the modern world. There's two philosophies, even in American culture, that take the place of these opposing views. And one of them is the autonomy of the individual and the freedom of the individual, and everyone's responsible for their own actions. But there's another concept in American culture that you can kind of see. It aligns more with this concept of obedience, in that yes, everyone is a leader, but also every leader is a follower. And not only that, but every good leader is a good follower. You cannot be a good leader without being a good follower. And what made me think of that was part of this passage right here. A certain grave doctor said that he would rather spend his life in picking up straws by obedience than by his own responsible choice busy himself with the loftiest works of charity. Because one is certain of following the will of God in whatever one may do from obedience, but never certain in the same degree of anything which we may do of our own proper movement. That makes me think of the role of the originator, the role of the prime leader that's at the top, and he's the one that's looking for problems and that's coming up with solutions for those problems. So he has to figure out himself. He's not just following orders, right? If you kind of follow through that image, that every good leader is a good follower, you kind of get this diagram. It's kind of like a hierarchy where you have the servants at the bottom, you have their leaders, and there's leaders upon leaders upon leaders, and there's this hierarchy, and at the very top there's God. And God is a good leader. He would be the prime leader. But at the same time, if he's a good leader, then he should be a good follower. Does this phrase not apply to him? And if you were to take this phrase and eternalize it and put it on a pedestal, you could say that, yeah, it probably does apply to him too. God being infinite, of course, you hear in grade school that you never divide by zero, because once you divide by zero, like, nothing makes sense. There's these characteristics of infinity that kind of like can make it sustain itself, that it doesn't really make sense. So at the very top, God is the paradoxical placeholder for the infinite, always. The cosmological argument for the creation of the world and all of that, right? So in this position, God is the prime leader, but he's also the prime follower, because he follows himself and he leads himself. And beyond that, everything else extends from God. Every leader is a follower. So everyone obeys something, right? And if you're one of those people, one of those initiators, one of those originators, one of those people that take inspiration from nothing and likes to walk their own way, one of those prime leaders, you might think that you work through initiative and you work through originality, but look again. And if you look again, you'll realize that you are actually listening to the voice of God. Now, what is the voice of God? Of course, you might think differently depending on your personal theology of what the voice of God is, but in this idea, if you're trying to eternalize this statement that every leader is a follower, every good leader is a good follower, the voice of God would be reality itself. Reality itself that's giving you hints to those issues. That's reality itself is where you get your motivation from. Reality itself is where you get the inspiration of where to go. You are listening to the world around you, and you're listening to the motive inside you that makes you want to fix those problems. So idealistically, this concept of every good leader is a good follower, that's kind of what it looks like. Even if you're your own boss that does not follow anybody, like you set your own path, you're still a follower under reality, under that inspiration, under that thing which you consider original, but that inspiration comes from somewhere. So if you don't believe in God, it can be the muses from Greek mythology or something like that, or just the concept of inspiration itself. But you're listening to those hints you get from nature itself, you get from reality itself. And the action that you finally take at the end, how you decide to solve a problem, will depend on the values that you prioritize. It will depend on the aspect of life that you put on a pedestal, the aspect of life that you worship, and that thing that you're following, that decision that you make in your heart, that is your leader. But that's how you make sense of that statement that every good leader is a good follower. When you look at it this way, like even the innovators, even the initiators, even the originators, they had to look at reality, at the reality of the situation, and they had to search for a solution. And these people, they're getting hints, and finally what this leader decides to do in the end is what is in his heart. Whatever gripped his heart when the decision was made, that's who his supreme leader is. So yes, this concept of obedience at first may seem very, very difficult to understand, very difficult to agree with, very difficult to resonate with, and also being from a Protestant background. But this is how you make sense of it. This is one of the ways that you can make sense of it, by thinking about it in this way. Also in Western culture and American culture, where we cherish individuality, where we cherish the freedom of the individual and the responsibility of the individual, it could also make sense in this way. So that's kind of how